Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dr. Silva. Thank you for joining me. I'm a board-certified psychiatrist, expert psychopharmacologist with nearly 30 years experience diagnosing and treating mental illness. I specialize in devising, implementing, revising, and managing adequate therapeutic trials of psychotropic medication and medication combinations, making sure that an adequate therapeutic trial is completed, which is often not the case. And I've helped thousands of people better navigate those trials. Be sure to check out my online academy, Not on an Empty Mind, for my premium content that you won't find anywhere else. And be sure to leave your email if you want to hear from me with special offers and more free content exclusively for viewers who subscribe and register. I've not only prescribed psychotropic medication to tens of thousands of people over the decades, I've taken many of these medications myself. I'm also in recovery from chemical dependency, so I'm intimately acquainted with what it feels like to alter one's brain chemistry, medicinally and recreationally, for better or worse. That certainly gives me a distinct perspective. Today you're in for a treat. Today I'm going to talk to you about fluvoxamine, Luvox, the fourth selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor to be approved in the United States after Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil. Like those medications, Luvox blocks the reuptake of the neurotransmitter serotonin, and I have another much earlier video on Luvox, the SSRI nobody's ever heard of, so please check it out for more basic information about this drug. But today is going to be a deep dive into one particular aspect of fluvoxamine in response to a recent request from a viewer to discuss the unique Sigma-1 opiate receptor binding property of fluvoxamine and the clinical implications of the high affinity of Luvox for that receptor. It's actually not an opiate receptor, though it was originally misclassified, but I'll explain shortly what an opiate is and the different types of opiate receptors. So this video is going to focus on a very specific property of Luvox. As I said, it's going to be a deep dive. I specialize in deep dives. I hope someday to be known for them. It's going to be very comprehensive. And so we're going to talk about how Sigma-1 agonism sets Luvox apart from the other SSRIs. If you're interested in an overview of this family of medications and how Prozac differs from Zoloft and how Paxil differs from Lexapro, be sure to check out my Prozac family video. Today I'm going to talk to you about Luvox and the Sigma receptor. But first, a little background. Luvox, which has long been available in a generic preparation, by the way. In fact, there are currently no brand name preparations of fluvoxamine available in the United States. The brand names have all been discontinued, no doubt because the manufacturer wasn't making enough money, because Luvox never really caught on. Currently, the medication is only available as generic fluvoxamine maleate in both immediate release tablets and extended release capsules. Luvox first became available in the United States in 1995 as an anti-obsessional agent, despite the fact that it was an established and effective antidepressant in various European countries for more than a decade, since 1983. That's how it is with regulatory agencies and administrative approvals of medications. It varies from country to country. It takes years, and it's not entirely driven by clinical factors. It's more about making money. And so in the United States, the makers had the bright idea of capturing a niche market by demonstrating to the FDA that fluvoxamine was safe and effective for the treatment of Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder, OCD, not MDD, not major depression. That's probably why most primary care providers have never heard of it. When it comes to treating clinical depression, PCPs continue to significantly out-prescribe psychiatrists. Up to 79% of new antidepressant prescriptions are written by non-mental health providers, and the trend toward primary care-based mental health treatment has only accelerated in recent years, with primary care visits involving psychotropic medications increasing significantly faster than psychiatric visits. Data as recent as 2024 confirms that primary care physicians and nurse practitioners together account for the majority of new antidepressant prescriptions. But OCD? Not so much. OCD is not as common as MDD, not nearly, and patients with OCD symptoms are more likely to be seen by a specialist. Primary care doctors are more likely to refer those patients on. And although practitioners are always free to prescribe off-label, that is, without FDA approval according to their best clinical judgment, FDA rules prohibit drug companies from marketing a medication for any indications outside of the drug's official approvals. And so, while I couldn't find any exact data, I have to assume that Luvox was largely overlooked by primary care in the US because they simply never heard of it. It wasn't promoted to them. They weren't targeted by the drug reps, even though any doctor can prescribe Luvox, because those doctors don't treat OCD and were unlikely to write new prescriptions. Had the manufacturer been able to market it for depression, that would have been a different story. But overseas approvals don't transfer, which honestly seems irrational given the huge multi-year, multi-center drug trials on human beings and the availability of post-market meta-analyses, years of data, millions of people, likewise subject to the mandates of mammalian physiology. But those are the laws. Any doctor can prescribe Luvox for any indication. We could give it for premature ejaculation if we wanted, and it would work. But what was then Solvay Pharmaceuticals could only promote it for the treatment of obsessive-compulsive disorder. And so they targeted psychiatrists. Primary care was left out of the loop. And there are still a lot of PCPs who've never heard of fluvoxamine. Luvox has consistently ranked among the least prescribed SSRIs, and this is because the incidence and prevalence of major depression is way greater than OCD. OCD has a 12-month prevalence of only 1.2% in the general population. That means that at any given time, in the span of a year, 1.2%, a little bit over 1 out of every 100 people in the general population will be diagnosed with this condition. And a lifetime prevalence of 1 to 3%, meaning that 1 to 3% of individuals will develop this condition sometime in their lifetime. Major depression is roughly 7 to 10 times more common. And the disorder is notably undertreated, with an estimated less than 20% of individuals globally receiving mental health treatment last year. And the mean time from symptom onset to initial pharmacologic intervention is nearly 8 years on average. Any serotonergic agent, any agent that increases serotonin is going to be useful in OCD. But to get approval from the FDA, you have to spend millions of dollars and many years doing phase 3 clinical trials to prove that it's safe and effective, that it's better than placebo. And so even though any SSRI is going to help with OCD, Luvox is the one that happens to have the FDA indication. I actually tend to think of Paxil before I think of Luvox for OCD, because Paxil is the most potent serotonin reuptake inhibitor in vitro. It blocks the reuptake of serotonin most potently, and so it increases the concentration of that neurotransmitter more than the others, at least in vitro. But anyway, Paxil does have the FDA indication for OCD, so they both actually have it. But even if Paxil didn't have it, is my point, I would think of it because it works. So if the makers of Paxil had to jump through all those hoops for the FDA, and they didn't have the indication, that wouldn't matter to me. In addition to its narrow, more esoteric indication, fluvoxamine requires twice daily dosing when we get to the higher doses, especially those required to treat OCD and anxiety in general. OCD is an anxiety spectrum diagnosis, but even major depression typically requires doses higher than 100 milligrams, and so the dose usually has to be divided. Not because of fluvoxamine's half-life of 15.6 hours, sufficient for once daily dosing from a pharmacokinetic perspective. No, the rationale for divided dosing at higher doses relates to tolerability rather than pharmacokinetic necessity. It's necessary for most patients, particularly at the outset, due to fluvoxamine's nonlinear pharmacokinetics that produce disproportionately higher peak concentrations as doses increase. Dose adjustments should be made no more frequently than weekly. The drug tends to accumulate. And Luvox has more gastrointestinal side effects than most of the other agents in this class. As far as diarrhea, only Zoloft, sertraline, with an incidence of loose stools of up to 20% of patients compared to placebo, surpasses Luvox's 11 to 18%. But unlike Zoloft, Luvox also not infrequently causes constipation, an incidence of up to 10%, depending on the formulation. It's most likely with the immediate release. The mechanism by which fluvoxamine causes constipation involves complex serotonergic effects on gastrointestinal motility. Meanwhile, sigma receptor effects on gut motility are likewise complex and context-dependent. But activity at this receptor is also a plausible contribution to fluvoxamine's constipation side effect. Luvox is less well tolerated than some other agents, with gastrointestinal side effects being more common, including diarrhea or constipation, but particularly nausea and vomiting that might lead to a higher dropout rate. The conventional wisdom here appears to be that, based on the comparative evidence, fluvoxamine is generally not a preferred first-line SSRI in primary care when options like escitalopram, sertraline, or citalopram are available, given their superior acceptability profiles and comparable or better efficacy. It really depends on what we're treating, though. Mirtazapine certainly has no GI side effects and can actually mitigate nausea caused by other drugs, but it's not as good at treating anxiety compared to the SSRIs. I wouldn't choose Remeron over Luvox for anxiety. I might add it to Luvox, especially if the patient were also experiencing insomnia and nausea. So we have to consider each case individually with particular attention to the target symptoms. If we start low and go slow and use the extended release formulations, we can obviate most tolerability issues. A lot of it depends on the skill of the practitioner in titrating the medication and in guiding the patient through the sometimes bumpy initial phase of treatment, making themselves available to the patient, providing strategies for reducing or avoiding side effects, and being proactive about that, and offering reassurances that those unpleasant adverse effects do tend to improve rapidly over time and that it's worth it to stick with it. Recent data confirms that fluvoxamine remains minimally used. It wasn't even separately tracked in a 2018 to 2022 JAMA Psychiatry analysis of antidepressant prescribing trends, suggesting negligible market share. Even the authors ignored it. The combination of inferior tolerability, inconvenient dosing, narrow indication, and a perceived lack of competitive advantages likely made fluvoxamine an unattractive option for pharmaceutical marketing to primary care physicians who needed simple, well-tolerated first-line agents for depression. They're not going to prescribe off-label. They're not going to go outside the scope of their expertise and increase their exposure to medical legal risk and prescribe a medication that is not approved for a syndrome that they're not experts in. They're going to refer those patients on, and the drug reps simply were barred by law from marketing the drug for that indication, so they really had nothing to say. Fluvoxamine was soon followed by the approval of Celexa, citalopram, the fifth SSRI in the United States, approved for the treatment of major depression, and aggressively marketed by Forest Laboratories. So Luvox was quickly relegated to specialty use. But are there truly no competitive advantages with Luvox? That's not what the viewer who requested this follow-up proposed in asking about Luvox's quite unique action at the Sigma-1 receptor. We shall see. Luvox was approved for the treatment of OCD in adults and pediatric patients ages 8 to 17, and although the extended release tablets, Luvox CR, controlled release, can be taken once at bedtime at all doses up to 300 milligrams, it was also indicated and promoted for the treatment of OCD in adults and pediatric patients in that same age group. The extended release version was developed to improve convenience with once daily dosing rather than to expand indications. And so poor little fluvoxamine was orphaned fairly early on, largely overlooked by the broader community of clinicians with prescriptive authority. So much so that eventually the trademark owners packed up and left town entirely. Fluvoxamine is no longer available as a brand name medication in the United States. Opiates are naturally occurring alkaloids derived from the opium poppy plant, Papaver somniferum, emphasis on somniferum, which means sleep-bearing or sleep-inducing in Latin, from somnus, sleep, and fere, to carry. This nomenclature reflects the ancient recognition of opium's soporific properties. Opium has been used for its sleep-inducing and analgesic effects for thousands of years, with evidence of cultivation dating back to ancient Mesopotamia and widespread use in Greek, Roman, and Egyptian medicine. Opiates include morphine and codeine, and they're used in medicine as analgesics and antitussive agents because they bind to endogenous opiate receptors. We have receptors that these natural drugs bind to make us sleepy and block pain and depress the respiratory drive. Not all of these effects are always welcome. They also bring a profound sense of well-being for most people, that everything's going to be okay. A warm, fuzzy, tingly feeling that, speaking as someone in recovery from chemical dependency myself, including opiate use disorder, I loved abusing hydrocodone. I'm not proud of it. Thankfully, I'm in remission from all that. Withdrawal can be pretty bad, not life-threatening, but maybe you wish you were dead. We have these receptors, not so plant-based opiate compounds can bind to them, but for the binding of endogenous opioids, endorphins, enkephalins, and others that have a myriad of important physiologic functions beyond just the mitigation of pain. Morphine and codeine and opium itself are opiates. But opioids also bind to the body's opium receptors, and they differ from opiates in that they're synthetic derivatives that do not occur in nature. Semi-synthetic medications like heroin, oxycodone, hydrocodone, and buprenorphine, which are derived from natural opiates. Heroin is diacetylmorphine, diamorphine, and fully synthetic compounds like fentanyl, methadone, tramadol, and others. The broader term opioids refers to all chemicals that bind to opioid receptors. And so there's three categories: natural opiate compounds from opium, semi-synthetic compounds, and fully synthetic compounds. So while all opiates are opioids, not all opioids are opiates. To be an opiate, it has to be naturally occurring. There's a family of opioid receptors, and three main subtypes are mu, delta, and kappa. But it's the mu receptor that's responsible for the preponderance of clinical effects due to opioids of all stripes, including analgesia, sedation, respiratory depression, euphoria, and physical dependence. Interestingly, the opium poppy remains the only commercial source for morphine, codeine, and the precursor thebaine used to manufacture semi-synthetic derivatives like oxycodone and naloxone. So, with the exception of the fully synthetic opiates, they all come from the poppy. I think we all remember The Wizard of Oz.
And now, my beauty, something with poison in it, I think. With poison in it, but attractive to the eye and soothing to the smell. Puppies. Puppies. Puppies will put them.
Now, as I've said, the sigma receptor is not actually an opioid receptor. Sometimes it's referred to as the sigma opiate receptor, but that's now recognized to be a misnomer. In 1976, it was proposed as part of the opioid receptor family, but molecular studies have since established that sigma receptors are structurally and functionally distinct from opioid receptors. The sigma receptor was originally identified as a naloxone inaccessible binding site that bound certain benzomorphan opiates, but not opioids in general, and neither naloxone, which is actually an opioid antagonist. It blocks receptors. Sigma receptors don't bind opioids directly and are not blocked by the classical opioid antagonist naloxone. They are, in fact, allosteric modulators of opioid receptors. They associate with those receptors and modulate their function without competing for opioid binding sites. I've talked extensively about allosteric modulation in other videos on benzodiazepines and the GABA receptor, so if you follow my channel, you know all about it. But if you missed that, be sure to check out these videos. I'll put links in the description and at the end. It's a similar concept here. Sigma receptors don't bind opioids, but when they're activated by their own ligands, such as fluvoxamine, they in turn affect the functionality of the mu, kappa, and delta receptors. When the allosteric site is bound, it affects the primary site where opioids bind. The details are a bit different from what I've discussed before about benzodiazepines, though. Benzos represent classical allosteric modulation of a single receptor protein. The benzodiazepine binding site and the GABA binding site are on the same transmembrane receptor complex, which is an ion channel. Conversely, Sigma-1 receptors participate in trans-protein allosteric modulation. They're separate, quote, chaperone proteins that physically associate with mu opioid receptors through direct protein-protein interactions, but they're on separate complexes. It's highly esoteric. What do we mean by modulation? Well, it depends on the type of sigma receptor. Sigma-1 receptor agonists diminish opioid analgesia. They interfere with opioid-induced signaling. As a potent Sigma-1 agonist, fluvoxamine would be expected to reduce opioid receptor signaling efficiency, potentially lowering the efficacy of narcotic pain medications requiring higher doses to achieve equivalent analgesia, an important drug-drug interaction to keep in mind, you providers in training out there. And the Sigma-2 receptor has the opposite effect, promoting mu opioid receptor-mediated analgesia, but here we're just concerned with Sigma-1. The modulatory role of sigma receptors extends beyond opioid receptors to include other receptors in ion channels such as NMDA receptors, and I've talked about those as well. So the whole story is well beyond the scope of this presentation and way above my pay grade. I assure you. It's way more. What we know is it's way more than anybody has the time to tell you, even in a deep dive. But Fluvoxamine is the SSRI with the highest affinity for Sigma-1 receptors, and this Sigma-1 agonism appears to contribute significantly to its therapeutic effects beyond serotonin reuptake inhibition. PET imaging studies in humans demonstrate that therapeutic doses of fluvoxamine, 50 to 200 milligrams generally, achieve high occupancy of Sigma-1 receptors throughout the brain compared to other SSRIs. This is quite unique to Luvox. Among SSRIs, the order of Sigma-1 receptor affinity is fluvoxamines greater than sertralines, which is greater than fluoxetines, greater than escitalopram's, greater than citalopram's, much greater than paroxetines. Paxil demonstrates negligible Sigma-1 binding. What's the clinical significance of this? Well, we believe that Sigma-1 agonism is integral to fluvoxamine's antidepressant action because studies show that fluvoxamine's antidepressant effects can be blocked by selective Sigma-1 receptor antagonists, while paroxetine is immune to those agents. And so this suggests that Luvox has a dual mechanism of action when it comes to its antidepressive effect. There are actually three main clinical effects mediated by Sigma-1 agonism: anti-inflammatory effects, neuroprotective actions, and enhanced antidepressant efficacy. Fluvoxamine regulates cytokine production through Sigma-1 receptor interaction with the endoplasmic reticulum. Sigma receptors are located on the endoplasmic reticulum, a vast network of interconnected membrane-enclosed tubules and sacs in eukaryotic cells with nuclei that acts as a major manufacturing, processing, and transportation system. It extends from the nuclear membrane, forming a continuous structure of these interconnected tubules and flattened sacs, and it is the largest cellular organelle, often occupying more than half of a cell's total membrane content. Anyway, the net effect here is that by activating those Sigma-1 receptor subtypes, Luvox reduces inflammatory responses. This mechanism gained prominent attention during the recent COVID-19 pandemic, where fluvoxamine prevented clinical deterioration in outpatients, likely through Sigma-1 mediated inflammation control. Luvox prevents excessive cytokine release. What are cytokines? Oh boy, it's super complicated. All the different types: interleukins, interferons, tumor necrosis factor. I dimly remember studying all of this in med school years ago. Some cytokines are pro-inflammatory, some are anti-inflammatory. But there's a phenomenon called cytokine storm, a life-threatening syndrome of immune system dysregulation characterized by excessive cytokine production, in which widespread, severe systemic inflammation and multi-organ dysfunction can progress to multi-organ failure and death. It can be triggered in autoimmune disorders, by cancer, sometimes in response to certain chemotherapies, and in response to infection by certain pathogens, including COVID-19. Deadly cytokine storms were observed in some patients with COVID. Can Luvox prevent these so-called storms? Early in the course of COVID-19 illness, fluvoxamine may help prevent clinical deterioration in some patients that could lead to cytokine storm. Though the evidence is mixed and insufficient at this time. We don't really know at this point, but the landmark study was published in JAMA in 2020, a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. In the fluvoxamine group, clinical deterioration occurred in 0% of 80 patients, compared with 6 out of 72 patients, 8.3% in the placebo group, 4 of whom required hospitalization, 1 of whom required mechanical ventilation for 10 days. The authors of the study were quick to emphasize that these findings should be considered, quote, hypothesis generating, rather than as a demonstration of efficacy, due to the small sample size, the fact that the study was conducted in a single geographic area, and other research design limitations. Beyond their role in modulating inflammation, Sigma-1 receptors are implicated in certain neuroprotective effects. Sigma-1 agonism promotes neurosteroid synthesis and protects against inflammation-induced impairments in synaptic plasticity and memory. A discussion of synaptic plasticity is likewise beyond the scope of this presentation, but it involves the ability of synapses to strengthen or weaken over time in response to changes in their own activity. This fundamental property of the nervous system allows neurons to modify the efficiency of signal transmission at their connections, forming the cellular basis for learning, memory, and adaptation to experience. And there are different types and mechanisms, but structurally, plasticity can involve the formation of new synaptic connections, the elimination of existing ones called pruning, or morphological changes in the dendritic spines of neurons. Dendrites receive incoming signals from other neurons. Impaired synaptic plasticity is implicated in numerous neuropsychiatric conditions, including depression, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's disease, and autism spectrum disorders. Fluvoxamine exerts neuroprotective effects through multiple Sigma-1 receptor-mediated mechanisms. Fluvoxamine's neuroprotective anti-inflammatory actions are actually quite robust. It protects the brain from inflammatory insults through Sigma-1 receptor activation and neurosteroid synthesis. These effects have been demonstrated across diverse neurological conditions, including stroke, traumatic brain injury, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and Alzheimer's, in which Luvox reduces beta amyloid production. In Parkinson's, long-term fluvoxamine treatment decreased non-motor symptoms and attenuated dopamine depletion in the striatum and other areas of the brain, suggesting protection of dopaminergic neurons specifically. Recent evidence also shows that fluvoxamine protects the integrity of the blood-brain barrier through Sigma-1 activation. So yeah, I think we've blown the idea that Luvox lacks competitive advantages over the other SSRIs out of the water here, at least theoretically. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, at least to psychiatrists, there's evidence of enhanced antidepressant efficacy owing to the combined serotonin reuptake inhibition and Sigma-1 receptor activation properties. Combination mechanisms are better than single mechanisms due to actions that are usually not just additive, but synergistic, where there's no redundancy. And this combination produces anti-anhedonic effects not seen with SSRIs lacking Sigma-1 activity, mediated through activation of prefrontal dopaminergic systems. Most SSRI therapy actually exacerbates anhedonia or induces it where it didn't already exist by increasing serotonin, which upsets the serotonin-dopamine balance, suppressing the activity of dopamine, to oversimplify, and thereby reducing pleasure. Anhedonia is a major symptom of depression, but it's also a major side effect of serotonergic antidepressant therapy. It's defined as a relative or absolute, it's a spectrum, lack of the capacity to experience and cultivate pleasure, including often sexual anticipation as well as gratification. So patients with anhedonia, they don't want to do anything or go anywhere. They don't want to do things that are fun not because they don't want to have fun, but because they can't have fun. And it is a dopaminergic impairment, and it's a very common feature of major depression. Or it is a side effect. I think it's more commonly, in my experience, it's more commonly induced by medications like Paxil. But in theory, we might see less anhedonia with Luvox because of Sigma-1 activation. Despite all of the above, though, there's no direct clinical evidence demonstrating that fluvoxamine causes less anhedonia or emotional blunting than other SSRIs, at least not yet. So it's a theoretical consideration. And lastly, there's evidence to show that fluvoxamine also improves cognitive function in depression, potentially through Sigma-1 mediated neuroplasticity and protection against stress-induced neuronal atrophy. Wow, it sounds like a superdrug. And yet, ironically, despite all of this evidence of unique benefits vis-a-vis Sigma-1 agonism, a landmark 2018 meta-analysis of 21 antidepressants found that Luvox ranked among the least efficacious drugs in head-to-head comparisons. Now, to be sure, these were not just SSRIs here, but other antidepressants as well, including tricyclic agents and other SNRIs. And pure SSRIs have been shown to do not as well against SNRIs, like the tricyclics, but also the modern agents, Effexor, Cymbalta, Benzema, etc. But a 2025 overview found no significant differences between Luvox and most other antidepressants, with the possible exceptions of Mirtazapine and venlafaxine in those reviews. And a 2010 review found no strong evidence that fluvoxamine was either superior or inferior to other antidepressants. So obviously the research is mixed, but each case is unique. And Luvox definitely demonstrates consistent superiority over placebo in achieving both antidepressant response and complete remission of symptoms. So it should certainly be used, and probably a lot more than it is. Thank you for your attention. As always, questions and comments are welcome.